All right, so welcome back to animal biology lecture. This is Intro to Zoology at Western Illinois. And my name is Dr. Richard Musser, and I'm going to continue this lecture. Remember, this is for my freshman biology students, and what I would like for you to do while you're watching this summary is write a short summary of what you learned from today's lecture to give you attendance points. The summary should be single space and about half a page to 3/4 of a page would be good, and then you'll submit it on Western Online. And so we talked about the scientific method and some basic aspects of what biology is, which is what zoology comes under. Zoology is obviously the study of animals, which is going to be the primary focus of this class. But to continue on this lecture, obviously the scientific method is what makes it a science. And the idea of evolution is probably the most important idea in the realm of biology, and probably one of the most important ideas for humans intellectually ever to come up. There's a lot of other ideas out there as well, but but I'll start getting into that in a little bit. So let's start talking about what evolution is and so forth. And we're going to be moving down that path. I'm sure most of you have some concept of evolution. You probably have a lot of misconceptions of evolution. And again, it's an area that is critical and super important that really takes a lifetime to even begin to really truly understand, and a deep, deep appreciation for. And we're going to try to get moving on understanding evolution a little bit better, because most everything we talk about in the rest of your studies in biology will have some aspect of evolution to it. You could even argue, even if you're planning to go into medicine, that evolution plays an important role as well. For instance, when we worry about bacterial resistance, you take an antibiotic. You know that, or you should know that if you take your antibiotic to help in stopping infection, and you start feeling better and you stop taking your antibiotic, there may still be bacteria living in your body that hasn't been killed by that antibiotic. These are bacteria that were naturally more resistant to the antibiotic. They start reproducing, and then you end up with a population that is now more resistant to the antibiotic. That is microevolution. That is evolution. And so as a medical doctor or healthcare provider, you need to be aware of how evolution is involved in antibiotic resistance. So evolution touches all sorts of areas of our life. Even non-biological evolution is still a concept. I mean, can you really look around at all the cultural evolution that's taken place, or the technological evolution? I mean, what we have as a cell phone now was non-existent when I was born. It was rotary phones. You had to call a long-distance operator to get anything. There was certainly no video chats, let alone something I could carry in my pocket. If I needed to find a phone, I needed to go find a quarter and a pay phone and put it in to call someone. So the world has dramatically changed technologically speaking. That is evolution, technological evolution. And it has follows a lot of the same principles of biological evolution. You know that, for example, just going along with the idea of the cell phone here, that there's lots of phones being made, and flip phones are going extinct because they're not as good, they're not as successful, they're not being selected by people that want phones. If everybody wanted a flip phone, manufacturers would be making lots and lots of flip phones. They would not be making these. So we are selecting and shaping that cultural things. Once we had some adaptations of new phone and technology, if it was popular by society, we selected it. Evolution works a lot of the same ways, where the environment is selecting adaptations. If you live in a cold environment. They're selecting, let's say, a snowy Arctic environment, selecting rabbits with a more whitish fur that's thick and can survive in the cold. So anyway, that's kind of beginning to introduce the idea of evolution to you. Again, I don't want you to be, I don't know what kind of preconceived notions you may have about evolution. I'm not trying to force it on you. Just realize it's a tool for understanding the world around us. We as humans have only, as far as science is concerned, has only been around here for about 100,000 years, and most of the technological and understanding advances have taken place in the last few hundred years. Maybe a few thousand if you want to start talking about modern civilizations like took place in Greece and Rome and stuff like that. So we haven't had a lot of time to figure things out yet. And we're just starting to make sense of a lot of things. But there's always going to be limitations on what we're able to figure out, especially in our lifetimes. So just remember, a scientist is like a detective. They're trying to figure out clues. Try not to give supernatural explanations. They're like a mechanic trying to repair a car. They're just going to look at mechanical, natural, physical things that they can measure. And they stay out of the realm of the supernatural in using that as an explanation. That's how the scientific method works. So like when we follow we're going to talk about evolution, the evolutionary tree of life, as this slide here is showing you. It is indicated that all organisms on Earth today descended from an original unicellular organism that lived around 4 billion years ago. Again, the first person, if you're not really used to the idea of evolution, how do we know this is true? I want you to step back and you take away that word true. We found evidence that demonstrates that bacteria and things like that were the prominent organisms. We looked at the fossil record. We know approximately how old the universe is, at least as regards to what we can measure based on how, the speed of light and how far something away is, or looking at the geological, like looking at the Grand Canyon, you see these different layers. Well, we have an idea of how long it takes for these layers. We have radioactivity, and we can measure decay and have an idea on how old things are. So we can look at a fossil and have an idea of how old it is. It's not perfect. And again, it's like being a detective. Detective does not perfectly know what happened in the crime scene. They piece together. So fossil record suggests that most of the life in the early stones that we measure, you don't see fossils of humans and others. You see bacteria through the microscopes. So again, we think it's around 4 billion years old. And so there were major evolutionary events that took place that made these simple species into more complex species. We don't know exactly how life started on Earth. You can argue that it was created if you want to use a supernatural explanation. But from an evolutionary perspective, it was the idea that we had the raw building blocks to make the amino acids and proteins and things like that and cellular materials. And with the right kind of atmospheric conditions, with carbon that's in the atmosphere and lightning, you can make some simple molecules that maybe eventually became more complex. But we don't really fully know all the answers. And there are scientists that study this that probably could give you a lot better explanation on this than I could. But they try to piece together, where did life come from? Now, if you have a religious belief, you might say, well, this is what scientists best can understand, and God, your belief might be that God did this. Just realize it doesn't come into the scientific work because we focus on what we can actually measure without a supernatural explanation. But what else gives us the idea that everything is related to everything? That is what evolution ultimately is saying in regards to life on Earth. Most everything is related to everything as far as we know. Is because we have, for instance, the same kind of DNA. and our bodies read it in a similar manner. So we could take the DNA of one animal, this is called genetic engineering, and put it into another animal, and that animal would start producing that protein, because genes are the recipe for proteins. And that is what gives us some evidence. All animals made up of cells. That's evidence for a common ancestry. So a lot of what we see in life is all the same. And then when we begin to look at the DNA of these different organisms, we see that they're very similar to one another, again, suggesting a common ancestor to all life, which would have been these unicellular organisms. And then they became more complex. As you remember, if you haven't watched the previous lecture, we talked about the endosymbiotic theory, the idea that one bacteria ate another bacteria. But instead of digesting it and eating it up, they developed a symbiotic relationship we call the endosymbiotic theory, in which this ATP making machine called mitochondria was providing energy to the cell that engulfed it, and the big soul, of course, is running around eating stuff. So this is how they developed this relationship, and then it became what we call multicellular. When cells started learning to live together, then we had multicellular colonies, and then these multicellular colonies became more complex into simple multicellular organisms, and then to more complex multicellular organisms. Again, it's because of what we're able to measure that we think this is the way it happened. Measuring DNA, looking at cells, and so forth. Now, some terms that we use in biology is simple and complex, and this isn't necessarily an insult, but we call simple organisms based on their level of complexity. So a bacteria would be simple in comparison to a human. That doesn't mean that bacteria is simple by any means. It's a lot more complex than, let's say, a rock. Geologically speaking, a rock is far more simple than a bacteria with the DNA and the proteins and the cells, the cell walls and the cell membranes. So something that's more complex, again, would be other multicellular organisms. They'd be more complex than a bacteria. You can make the argument that a 4-chambered heart found in mammals is more complex than a 3-chambered heart found in mammals, or a 2-chambered heart found in fish. So this kind of helps us to figure out the terms ancestral and derived. Ancestral means what is the original condition, and derived is what it evolved from. So going back with the idea of hearts, a fish has a 2-chambered heart. And the idea is that some fish species moved onto land, formed a 3-chambered heart, or more amphibian-like, and then amphibians became reptile-like, a certain branch of them, not all of them. Some reptiles became mammal-like, and so you would argue that those are derived characteristics. It's thought that birds, for instance, evolved from dinosaurs. Why do they think that? Well, they see some feathery dinosaurs, and the idea is that the scales evolved into feathers, and so that would be the derived trait, while the scales were the ancestral trait. So like a 2-chambered heart is the ancestral trait. A 4-chambered or 3-chambered heart is the derived trait. So remember, adaptations is what allows for species to survive environments, and that's the main selective force in the environment. Snowy, cold environment selects animals with thick fur and can survive and camouflage better. Animals living in desert regions have kidney that can really conserve water. So that, or if they're a plant, even though it's not a plant class, they might have thicker, waxier cuticles and thin cactus-like ways of controlling water loss. But anyway, those are called adaptations. Birds, obviously penguins are birds, for example, that evolved from species that could fly, and then lost that ability to live in an ocean life, so they adapted to living in that kind of environment. Now, did evolution, was that term, how long has that term been around? How long have people thought about it? The idea of evolution versus fixed species. So the idea is either species never change, or species have some ability to change and or become new species. That's the idea of evolution, is the evolution. So the idea of evolution has been around for a long time, for hundreds of years. It wasn't even Charles Darwin that originally came up with this idea, that came in with that idea, that Charles Darwin came up with the idea. Charles Darwin was able to come up with an explanation to how evolution worked, and that's what we call natural selection. So natural selection means that the environment is selecting for certain traits. But the idea of evolution has been around as long as 1707. It's probably been around a lot longer than that as well. And these are things that helped to shape Darwin's ideas and for him to consider how evolution might work and try to figure it out. There was also lots of other things that have occurred, like Buffon observed that there are similarities in the limbs of animals. And this provides evidence for evolution, and that they came from a common ancestor. So let me show you a picture of that. So if you look at this human arm on the left, or in the middle you have a dog foreleg, and on the right you have seal flipper. Notice that the human arm we'll go through all of them, and the dog foreleg have the same bones, but how they are actually made for the environment is dramatically different. And if you look at the seal flipper, you'll see that it has the same bones as the dog leg and the human arm. So the idea is that they all share a common ancestor. They all came from animals with these basic bone structures. And then some of these animals specialized in living in the water, and eventually came to be what we have as modern seals. Some animals follow the carnivore path and became dogs and canines and so forth. And then the human arm, came from different primates. I mean, if you look at this primate, the human arm, and consider apes and monkeys, they have this basic structure. But but the point is we're not just related to those animals, we're related to dogs. But our ancestry would have been a lot further back. Now, if you look at these different embryos here, you see that they have gill slits. Now, are some of these embryos human? Which one's you're looking at these 4 embryos, which one's human? Are all of them human? Or all of them, could they be different things? And we're going to look at the next slide in a minute, but could you guess which one's human? And does it really matter for my point? All these embryos have gill slits. Does that mean that they have evolved from aquatic animals? And then it's showing up in the embryological history? And why would we need gill slits? Yet our embryos have them. They all have, for all these different animals here that are embryos, they all have a vertebrae. Even the human has a tailbone. And sometimes humans may have a little bit of what looks like a tail that needs to be removed, though it's a very unusual condition. But my point is that you can see there's a lot of similarities among all of these embryos, and that suggests an evolutionary relationship, that they're all related to one another at some level. But again, the ancestry goes far back into time. So on the right is the human embryo and the bird embryo, the reptile embryo and the fish embryo. See how similar they are. Yet they're dramatically different when they become adults in appearance. But the basic structures are there. We all have vertebrates, backbones, I mean, when I say that. We all have eyes, mouths, the basic structures are there, the ears are basically there. Why have this same pattern and plan? Unless maybe there was some type of common relatedness and then things evolved and went in different directions and adapted to their particular environments. That's how evolution would explain it. Otherwise, why bother with embryos? If everything is a fixed species that was created by itself, why bother having a human embryo with gill slits? It's not just the bones and the outside appearance that suggests there's an evolutionary relationship. We can also see it in the molecules that make up our bodies. So hemoglobin, as you can see from the slide, this slide here is talking about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein found in red blood cells. Hemoglobin is the carrier of oxygen in your red blood cells. And so we know the amino acids that are needed to make that protein, hemoglobin. If you're not familiar with amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And so this particular protein, hemoglobin, again, is found in red blood cells. It holds on to oxygen. So if you look at this slide, you can see that animals that look more similar to each other also have hemoglobin that is more similar to each other. So if you look at the human and the macaque, these are what we both be considering primates. They have most of their hemoglobin is the same except for about 8 different amino acids. So hemoglobin might have hundreds or thousands, thousands of amino acids to make this protein. But there's only 8 amino acids difference between our hemoglobin in our blood and the macaques. Now, an animal that is more different from us is a dog, but it's still a mammal. Mammals have what? Fur, warm-blooded, give live birth, mammary glands, that's important for mammals, so they provide milk. So the macaque monkey, the dog, and the human are all mammals. How much difference is there in the amino acids of the hemoglobin of dogs and that of the human? 32. So it's still not a lot of difference. What we're able to do, though, is get an idea of their evolutionary relationship because of the hemoglobin differences that are present. Now, a bird is quite a bit different than a mammal. Still pretty warm-blooded, has a 4-chambered heart. But now we have feathers, a lot of flight, lay eggs, no more live birth. But they have a vertebrate, they have a backbone. There's a lot of similarities still in comparison to, say, a slug or an insect. So the hemoglobin of macaques, of this chicken here, this bird representation, is 45 amino acids in comparison to the human. So again, showing a more evolutionary distance from the human. Going even further back into more ancestral traits, we see this very primitive fish we call a lamprey. Lampreys have 125 amino acids difference in comparison to the human. So there is a big difference, comparatively speaking, in the amino acids of hemoglobin in lampreys than in humans. But I would still make the argument that humans and lampreys are much more similar than humans and insects or snails or some other type of animal that doesn't have a backbone. All these animals here have backbones of some sort. So again, this molecular information is doing what the arm was showing, similarities and differences. And this can give you an idea of how far something may have evolved from one another as well. So the greater the number of amino acids difference, the greater the evolutionary distance. What about DNA? We can look at DNA also and do what we call make a molecular clock. So when you look at nucleotide substitution, so we have DNA, and the DNA similarities can help us to see how similar two different animals are. But let's step back for a moment. If I was at a crime scene and unfortunately did a crime and a little bit of my blood fell onto the crime scene, that detective could collect that blood sample, do some forensic chemistry with it or biology with it, and get an idea if that sample, and then they collected my sample somewhere else because I was a suspect, they can compare the two. And if there's a match, I'm in pretty big trouble. We have the science to be able to tell whether or not there's a match. Now, if the blood was collected from my brother, it'd be a pretty similar match. If it was collected from my cousin, pretty similar. And then further away from that, it would look like a stranger and they would be completely cleared. Why is it that my brother's blood and my blood are more similar? Well, we share a more recent common ancestor, our parents. My cousins and I share an ancestor with my grandparents. People in a region share a more recent ancestor than people from other regions. Animals that look more similar to one another shared a more recent ancestor. And so looking at the DNA of animals of various sorts, and humans are a type of animal, mammals to be more exact, and primates, we're going to look at the DNA of cytochrome C, which is another protein that animals make. And so if you compare the nucleotides of horses and donkeys, you'll see that they're relatively close to one another. That suggests that horses and donkeys, if you look at the bottom, is on what we call the x-axis. So we have the y-axis, which is the nucleotide substitution, and the x-axis is the millions of years ago. You see horses and donkeys have cytochrome C gene that is more similar to one another than humans and kangaroos. So that means the horses and donkeys are more related to each other, more recently related, share a more recent common ancestor. And as you can admit, horses and donkeys look more similar as well. So not only is it true morphologically, but also it's true on the molecular level. And we have an idea of how often the DNA changes, and we call these mutations, when a DNA changes its nucleotide for another one. And so we have an idea of how often that happens, and we can call that a molecular clock. So again, looking at this chart, we see that horses and donkeys are more similar, more closely related to each other. Sheep and goats are more closely related to each other than, and then compared to, and then goats and cows, for instance, are more closely related to each other. But notice a pig and a cow is pretty distant from one another. A horse and a cow is actually pretty different from one another. Humans and cows are even greater difference. So again, this gives us an idea of how closely related organisms are to each other and how far apart in evolutionary time they are from one another. So the idea is that the human and the kangaroo have 110 million years of difference in time with one another, while the donkey and the horse may have evolved from each other a few million years ago, a handful of millions of years ago, 5 million years ago. But humans and kangaroos, we are over 100 and 15 million years apart. So that gives you some idea of the evolutionary time span when these species evolved from one another. Now remember, at that time, there would have been 125 million years ago, kangaroos and humans did not exist, but they shared a common ancestry, perhaps around that time. So this is how evolution, so let's talk about how evolution works and how evolution doesn't work. So if we were to look at your family tree, you see your great-grandfather, your grandfather, your father, and you. You're not exact replicates of your father. You didn't just change. Let me go over here and explain over. So if you look at to the right side, we have fish, salamander, cat, and human. And so the point is evolution doesn't work in this linear pattern, neither any more than your family tree does. So you didn't evolve from a monkey, you didn't evolve from an ape, but you shared a common ancestor, just like you shared a common ancestor with a cat. You're not a direct difference between your father. You didn't just evolve from your father, but you shared a common ancestry. So how does evolution really work? And how does your family tree really work? Let's look below. So let's again look on where my cursor is, and you see this is your family tree. Over here you see you. And you see siblings. So you are derived from your siblings. Well, excuse me, you came from your parents. You share a common ancestor. So that's a node. So when you look at the family tree, you see your parents, you see a node, and then you see that your siblings are here and you are here. You share a common ancestor, your parents. You're more similar to one another. You and your siblings are more similar to one another than anybody else in this audience or in your community. You look more similar, you talk and think more similar because you share a lot of the same genes. Of course, you share some culture too, but your common ancestor is your most recent common ancestor is your parents. Now, what about your cousins? Well, your cousins and you look more similar to one another and your other siblings because you all shared a common ancestor at this node. That's what this is called, a node on this family tree, called your grandparents. Similarly, your second cousins will have a lot of similarities in genes shared with you because you share the great-grandparents. So you're going to look more similar to one another than other people from other regions. Then if you keep following this logic, people from a region, especially before we had a lot of commuting and traveling and stuff like that, looked more similar to one another because they share ancestors in that community together, albeit it might be several greats behind. And if I wanted to take this even further, humans and primates, like chimpanzees, look more similar than humans and a dog or a cat. Why would the chimpanzee look more similar to the humans? Because if you go far enough back, we shared some type of common ancestor. And we can see that in the DNA of our hemoglobin, as I showed and talked about in the other slides. Just like if I looked at the genes or the hemoglobin in you versus your siblings, I would see a lot more similarities because you shared common ancestry with your parents. And people in certain regions are going to share a lot more genes because they shared great-grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents. And so if you follow that logic far enough back, we share a lot more genes with chimpanzees than we do with cats because we shared a more recent common ancestor. Now, I don't know what grade you would give it, but it'd be hundreds of thousands of years ago where there were um, a common ancestor between chimpanzees and another hominid-like ape. And so if you go to the right, you'll see an evolutionary tree where we share a common ancestor with mammals. So cats and humans have a common ancestor of some sort millions of years ago that makes us more similar to each other because we're both mammals. We both give live births. We have warm-blooded. Amphibians are more distantly related, but we still share a common ancestor that allowed us to have 4 legs and a vertebrae. And then we had some fish species that were able to walk on land where we would have had a common ancestor. So that's what I would have loved to the amphibians, but we have some type of common ancestry even with fish in the ocean and sharks, at least in comparison to sea slugs that don't have a backbone. Again, now we're talking hundreds of millions of years ago, if you follow that basic understanding and logic. So that makes you kind of wonder, well, and this is where you can throw out this crazy misconception. Humans did not evolve from modern chimpanzees. Modern chimpanzees went on their own evolutionary path, and humans and hominids went on this evolutionary path that we ended up having modern humans. Just like a lot of fish have evolved and continued that path of just being some type of sea fish, while a very distant ancestor, hundreds of millions of years ago, was a fish that could kind of crawl out onto land and breathe and was more amphibian-like, and then became amphibians. And then there were some amphibians that are a little bit more reptile-like and had the ability to stay on land, had a little bit more dry skin, and then they went off on their evolutionary path. And then some some reptiles were more mammal-like, and then they evolved and went on their own path. Some dinosaurs developed some feathers that helped us to have birds, and they went on their evolutionary path, while other dinosaurs went extinct because feathers obviously were advantageous during a massive extinction event that occurred on Earth, likely due to some type of asteroid hitting the Earth and changing the atmosphere. Again, how do we know that kind of stuff? Well, people that are really interested in that look at the fossil record and they see there's a major extinction event that takes place, and we see changes in the fossil record. And then they can look at dust that's settled and get some ideas of what happened. We're never going to have absolute truth. We are a detective trying to put the pieces together. And the importance of science is asking the question. We're not going to always have the answers. You have to accept that you live in a world where you're not going to have all the answers. And so the questions is what is important. And then you get some approximate truths. So either you can presume that nothing has ever changed, or very little has changed, or you accept the idea that life can change. In my opinion, the Earth has been around, it's not just my opinion, but following what I understand from the smartest minds that worked and spent their lives working, trying to figure this kind of stuff out, the Earth is very old, billions of years old. How life looks today as I'm alive is a lot different than it looked thousands of years ago, let alone hundreds of thousands of years ago, let alone millions of years ago. And it's easy, I think, when you look at technology to realize how much things can change. This is unbelievable compared, and again, this is technological evolution, which is a little bit different. It's obviously quite a bit different than evolutionary evolution or biological evolution. But things have changed a lot since I was born. Tremendous changes have occurred. it's always amazing how much changes occur from year to year, and you don't even perceive them hardly. If you lived in a town that's been growing, big changes have occurred. Restaurants come and go. People come and move, and everything's changing. So it's not hard for me to accept the idea, because I don't look at it as a belief, that species aren't fixed. Another example of how we can kind of get at this idea of common ancestry. You know, you look at waterfowl, ducks and geese and so forth. They look a lot more similar than eagles and falcons. That's because these birds evolved and these birds became waterfowl. These birds over here became falcons and eagles and hawks. Why do they all look similar? Because they shared a common ancestry. And then, of course, birds share a common ancestry. They adapted to their environments, a waterfowl environment to a predatory environment. So these are some of the examples of what I'm getting at. We're going to get into a little bit about Darwin and so forth, but let me share a little fun video with you for a moment. So some of you may have been fans of Futurama. It's been around a long time, and of course there's no new shows of it. It kind of makes fun of the creationist idea of the missing link and how we don't have evidence for the missing link. And that's proof that evolution doesn't exist. Well, the thing is with the fossil records, it's never going to be perfect. Again, we are detectives. We're digging through, trying to find fossils. It's hard to find fossils, especially fossils of humans. So people have taken expeditions down to Africa and other places. The idea is, as you know, primates primarily took off in Africa. And so Africa, as best as we know, is the breadbasket of humankind. And from there, humans moved out to populate the rest of the earth. And so before that, there were hominids. Before there was modern humans, there were some type of hominid. So we had some animals that are like Australopithecines that are very small hominids that are kind of chimpanzee-ish like. And then we have all varieties of Australopithecines, from robustus with huge jaws and afarensis. And then we had hominids like ourselves. We're a type of hominid, but we also had Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and so forth. And they actually, in this clip, referred to some of the known hominids. Hominids, of course, that means hands and things like that. That's a family hominidae. And so this video kind of makes a little fun of that, and I think it's kind of amusing. So I'm going to have us watch part of it and talk about it as we go through.
I don't understand evolution, and I have to protect my kids from understanding it. We will not give in to the thinkers.
You people are as loud as you are ignorant. Now get back on your turnip trucks and go home. That is an insultingly accurate stereotype, sir. As a professor of science, I assure you that we did, in fact, evolve from filthy monkey men.
I cannot speak for you, sir, but my ancestors...
Now remember, when I talk about evolution, we've never evolved from a chimpanzee. We shared a common ancestry. And then it's like the nodes, it keeps coming off. And if you think about it, look at the diversity of other animals. Where did modern dogs come from? The idea is they've evolved from wolves. And then think about all the varieties of dogs, to the point that it almost looks like speciation, even though humans are directing the evolution of dogs. We call that artificial selection. But how can you go from a 14-pound toy poodle to 140, pound Saint Bernard or whatever weight they get, 100 something pounds? That's almost two different species as far as I'm concerned. Can they really interbreed? We got near speciation with our ability to select organisms that never existed until humans came around. Even the modern food that we eat, corn and things like that, that is human invention or evolution. It's human guided evolution of these crops. So anyway, this gets pretty cute. So the professor here is making the argument for evolution. The creationist is going to come up here and demonstrate that evolution is false because you can't prove that missing link.
Were not monkeys. They were orangutans. Hard-working, patriotic orangutans.
Dr. Banjo?
In the fur. And I remind you that evolution is merely a theory, like gravity or the shape of the Earth.
Hey, Professor, I'm a flying spaghetti monster. You seriously believe I'm descended from some kind of flightless manicotti?
Yes!
Oh.
So again, the other thing that creationists like to do is, oh, it's just a theory, as if evolution is just a theory. So it's not that important. It's not any different than your crazy uncle's theories or something like that, or crazy aunt's theories. As we talked about, theories are a much bigger deal in evolution, or excuse me, in science. They're hypotheses that have been tested, looked at, tried to be falsified for decades or longer, over 100 years, right? Evolution, the idea of natural selection through evolution through natural selection has been around for over 100 years. And yet it is still the cornerstone of what we're doing today.
Oh, please. A far more logical explanation is the undisprovable science of creaturism. All life was created in its present form 7,000 years ago by a fantastical creature from outer space.
Bunk!
Oh? If your elitist East Coast evolution is real, why has no one found the missing link between modern humans and ancient apes?
We did find it. It's called Homo erectus.
Then you have proven my case, sir. For no one has found the link between apes and this Homo erectus.
Yes, they have. It's called Homo habilis.
Aha! But no one has found the missing link between ape and the so-called Homo habilis.
Yes, they have. It's called Australopithecus africanus.
Oh, I've got you now. Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius macilli? Answer me that, Professor.
Oh, okay, granted that one missing link is still missing. But just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Pshaw! Things don't exist simply because you believe in them. Thus saith the almighty creature in the sky!
So again, I think you get the point of that. It helps to kind of joke a little bit, but it shows you how ridiculous people may hold on to their beliefs. And again, I'm not arguing not to hold on to religious beliefs, but I don't want religious beliefs to stop you from considering using evolution as a tool. It's a tool that helps us to understand who we are, where we may have come from, but it also is a tool that helps us to understand, as I mentioned earlier, antibiotic resistance. It's a tool for us to understand where things come from. Why bother using mice for medical research unless they had an evolutionary relationship that was close enough to us to give us some idea of how this medicine might work? So evolution is important way beyond even just this biology class. It helps you to see the world differently. Now, this is just, obviously we're going to be discussing evolution quite a bit in this class. It'll come up throughout the whole semester. This is just us beginning to scrape a little bit of what evolution is and how it might work. Again, some of the big points to take from this is that you can see the idea that evolution, we share a common ancestry. Evidence for this common ancestry might be anatomy and morphology, seeing the skeleton. It also might be the molecular biology that's in our body as far as the genes and how similar and different they are. So this is going to be quite a few more classes on this, quite a few more lectures on this before we really get into the rest of zoology. And I hope you develop a better appreciation. Maybe you came from a background that wasn't very strong in the idea. But again, if nothing else, accept or think about evolution as a tool for understanding life. If I wanted to get an idea of how once animal adapted to the polar region, like bears or something like that, looking at all the different species of bears. Some bears that live in Asia, grizzly bears and Kodiak bears and black bears and all sorts of honey bears, and there's all sorts of different types of bears. They shared a common ancestor, then they adapted to these environments. You have an idea of their similarities based on their parents and location, and so scientists can come up with some ideas. So again, I'm just saying it helps us in all sorts of ways of understanding the world and ourselves. So with that note, write your summary of this paper, upload it. It'll be lecture number 2. You'll get credit for being here. Do a good job. Show that you've learned something. Focus on some of the new objectives you got from this. How does some ideas about how evolution works. Maybe touch on endosymbiotic theory. And I look forward to seeing you in lecture number 3. Take care.